If you go back to the Pentateuch, here's what's interesting. You make a false accusation against a person, and it's found to be false, and you knew it to be false, the punishment that would have came upon them had it been true goes upon you. Yeah. Rome had some very severe penalties for those who made false accusations. Well, good morning. It's good to see everyone. Let me say something real quick before I get going, because I do have 38 minutes and I want to make sure I get through this. I'm looking at the clock right now. Our Christmas service is just next week, and I'm going to be teaching some things that everyone needs to hear. So make sure you get out and invite. I tell you, our church is so blessed. We have the best of everything. Truly do. We have the best worship. We have the best children's church. I'm telling you, Amy does a fantastic job. She's creative. She's organized. She's such a hard worker. She's great at recruiting. I'm telling you, if your children come to church here, they're going to learn under Amy and her volunteers, and I so appreciate that. Our youth department's really growing. Casey's doing a wonderful job there. My brother Riddell's helping with it. It's a tremendous blessing to our church, and I tell you, I'm going to be teaching some things this next year that you really need to hear. In fact, when we start back with every one Sunday in January, about the third week, maybe the fourth, but I'm going to be teaching on money from a biblical perspective. The truth of the matter is, most of you don't know a lick about money. Nothing about money. That sounds horrible, doesn't it? Sounds really snarky. But the reason I say that is because we don't talk about money in homes. I don't know why that is. Now, I grew up in a home that was a little bit different. I grew up in a home where we talked about everything. My dad talked about money, but just talking with people, it's interesting to me to find out that the parents didn't talk much to the children about money. And as a result of that, they just kind of watched what their parents did, and they do the very same thing. And it shouldn't be that way. In fact, the Bible has a lot to say about money. And that's what we're going to be talking about. You know me, I'm going to address every issue, and that's one of the issues that needs to be addressed. Anyways, last week we were supposed to study Paul's arrest, but I ran out of time before we got to the part where he was arrested. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to quickly go through what happened to him so that we can move on. So here's what happened. Paul was in the temple when some Jews from Asia, more specifically Ephesus, saw Paul there. And they incited a riot by accusing Paul of bringing a Gentile into the temple. You see, the Temple Mount was specifically divided into 6 different areas. You had the court of the Gentiles, where everyone and anyone could come, as long as you were considered to be clean. It was also known as the outer court. And then you had the women's court, which was open to all Jews, both male and female, but it was off limits to Gentiles. Then you had the court of the Israelites, which only men could enter. Women were not allowed to enter there. Then you had the court of the priests, where the altar and the laver were. This is where the priests ministered, and they carried out their part of the Mosaic sacrificial system. Then you had the temple building itself, which was divided into 2 areas. The first room, which was before the veil, also known as the holy place. Inside this room, you had the table of showbread, the candlestick or candelabra, and the golden altar of incense. And then you had what was called the Holy of Holies, which was behind the veil. The high priest could only enter into this place one time a year on the great day of atonement. And even then, there was a specific way in which he entered in. The Holy of Holies contained the Ark of the Covenant. Inside the Ark of the Covenant was a golden pot of manna, the rod of Aaron, and the tablets of stone which God gave to Moses. In other words, the 10 Commandments. Now, during the time of Jesus and Paul, the Ark of the Covenant was not inside the Holy of Holies. Where it was and where it is today is a great mystery. We don't know. There's several theories. One theory is that when Jeremiah prophesied that the Babylonians were going to destroy the city and the temple. The priest who believed him, along with Jeremiah, allowed him to move the Ark of the Covenant and hide it, because they knew the Babylonians were going to destroy the city and the temple, and they were going to take the spoils from the temple. And then they also believe that after that took place, and Jeremiah and the group of Jews went down to Egypt, they took it down there and it ended up in Ethiopia. How many of you have heard that? Others believe that it's underneath the Temple Mount somewhere in a secret tunnel that's been sealed off. In fact, there's actually one archaeologist that claims to have seen it before it was sealed off again, because the Muslims control the Temple Mount. Israelites actually control it, but they allow that to take place in order to try and keep peace. So, I won't tell you what I believe. Maybe I'll save that for another time. But anyways, what I want you to understand is they still went into the Holy of Holies, did everything they were supposed to. But during the time of Jesus, the Second Temple period, and Paul, the Ark of the Covenant was not in the Holy of Holies. So, what they were accusing Paul of was bringing a Gentile into the inner court past the court of the Gentiles. And that was punishable by death. In fact, the wall that separated the outer court from the inner court had warning signs posted all along it. And this is what it said. No foreigner, referring to Gentiles, is to enter within the forecourt and the walls around the sanctuary. Whoever is caught will have himself to blame for his subsequent death, because again, it's punishable by death. So, when these Jews from Ephesus saw Paul inside the inner court, they assumed that he had brought Trophimus into the inner court with him, because earlier that day they had seen Paul in the marketplace with Trophimus, who was a Gentile. Look at Acts chapter 21, verses 27 through 29. The 7 days were almost ended when some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul in the temple, and they roused a mob against him. They grabbed him, yelling, "Men of Israel, help! This is the man who teaches against our people and tells everybody to disobey the Jewish laws. He speaks against the temple, and he even defiles it by bringing Gentiles in." For earlier that day, they had seen him in the sea with Trophimus, a Gentile from Ephesus, and they assumed Paul had taken him into the temple. Now, this started a riot, and of course the Roman soldiers, they got involved and they arrested Paul. Of course, they didn't know what was going on. All they knew was this group of Jewish men inside on top of the Temple Mount was trying to kill Paul. So, to get to the bottom of it, the Roman commander Lysias decided to flog Paul to find out what he had done. That was the common thing that you did. You want someone to admit what they were doing wrong, then you just beat it out of them. And that's what he was going to do. And as they were preparing for that, Paul told Lysias that he was a Roman citizen. And when Lysias found out that he was a Roman citizen, he couldn't do that. He himself would be punished for doing that. So instead, he took him to the Sanhedrin council to try and find out what he had done that made the Jews so angry. Now, the Sanhedrin was made up of both Pharisees and Sadducees. The Sadducees were usually the high priest along with his top advisors. They were, I'll just stop right there. The Pharisees were really the heroes of the common people. They believed differently, and we'll get into that in just a second. The Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead or angels or spirits. In fact, that's why they were sad, you see. Yeah. I know, cheesy. But anyways, they did not believe in the resurrection. They did not believe in spirits. They did not believe in angels. So in essence, they were liberals and did not believe in the Jewish Bible. Amen. Seriously. You can't read the Old Testament without believing in the resurrection, because it clearly states there will be a resurrection. It also tells you that there are angels and that there are spirits. So they didn't believe that, which tells you that they were very liberal. They were a religious group and people, but they were not spiritual. So when Paul said that he was a Pharisee and that he was on trial because he believed in the resurrection of the dead, those two groups got into it. Look at Acts chapter 23, verses 6 through 9. Lysias has brought Paul to the Sanhedrin. These are Pharisees and Sadducees. They don't like each other. The only time they get along is when they have a common enemy. Yeah. And when they have a common enemy, then they get along. So notice what Paul did when he's brought before the Sanhedrin. Acts 23, verses 6 through 9. Paul realized that some members of the high council were Sadducees and some were Pharisees, so he shouted, "Brothers, I am a Pharisee." He did not say he was a Pharisee. Paul still considered him to be a Pharisee even after his conversion, because Pharisees believed in interpreting the Bible literally. Yes, there are figures of speech, but you interpret the Bible literally. They believed that there would be a Messiah. They believed all of the prophetical, eschatological, messianic prophecies. So Paul says, I am a Pharisee, as were all my ancestors. And I am on trial because my hope is in the resurrection of the dead. This divided the council, the Pharisees against the Sadducees. For the Sadducees say there is no resurrection or angels or spirits. But the Pharisees believe in all of these. So a great clamor arose. Some of the teachers of religious law who were Pharisees jumped up to argue that Paul was all right. Leave this man alone, he's a Pharisee. We see nothing wrong with him, they shouted. Perhaps a spirit or an angel spoke to him. Now they're getting facetious. Now they're getting snarky. Possibly something that you don't believe in is why he's here. Yeah, that's what they're saying. So in order to protect Paul, the commander returned him to the barracks. That's when 40 Jews made a vow to kill Paul. They vowed not to eat or drink until Paul was assassinated. Well, Paul's nephew found out about it, so he went to the commander and he went to Paul. So the commander sent Paul to Caesarea under a military guard along with a letter. The reason he sent him to Caesarea was because that was the administrative and judicial center for Judea. And Felix was the Roman procurator of their province, so he was responsible for presiding over Paul's trial. Now, Luke records the contents of the letter. In other words, what the letter said. Look at Acts chapter 23, verses 25 through 30. Then he wrote this letter to the governor. From Claudius Lysias, he's the commander, to his excellency, Governor Felix, greetings. So he is the procurator. He holds the position that Pilate did when Christ was crucified. And unlike that, he's not going to live in Jerusalem. He's going to live in Caesarea. This man was seized by some Jews, and they were about to kill him when I arrived on the scene with the troops. When I learned that he was a Roman citizen, I removed him to safety. Then I took him to their high council to try and find out what he had done. The high council is what? The Sanhedrin. Notice he says to their high council. So he's referring to the high council of the Jews, which is the Sanhedrin. Some of you pronounce it Sanhedrin. That's fine. If you look in the Greek, it's pronounced Sanhedrin. I soon discovered it was something regarding their religious law, certainly nothing worthy of imprisonment or death. But when I was informed of a plot to kill him, I immediately sent him on to you. I have told his accusers to bring their charges before you. And that's where we're going to start this morning. Paul's being taken to Caesarea, which is on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. Now, let me say a little bit about Caesarea. It's called Caesarea Maritima. Most people don't realize this, but Caesarea is where Marco Polo sailed to when he went out to China. I don't know if you knew that. Yeah. It was a very prestigious port at the time, and the Silk Route and the spice route actually went through Israel. Israel is at the cross between Europe, Asia, and Africa. And as a result of that, it's the most valuable piece of property on this planet. That's why there's so much trouble there. This was not some corner that was tucked in the far world. When the Roman Empire came into existence, they wanted to control it. When the Persians, before the Roman Empire came in, they needed to control it. The Parthians needed to control it. When Rome was divided up between its generals, that was the most important piece of property on the whole continent, or I should say, upon the whole world. Still is today. Yeah. So anyways, this is Caesarea. What's interesting is there is no natural port for Israel. So Herod the Great actually created a man-made harbor. Now, anyone know why Herod is called Herod the Great? It's not because he did great things. It's because he was a great architect and builder. One of the greatest architects and one of the greatest builders of all time. In fact, he's the one that actually came up with the ability to have cement cure underwater. If you ever go to Greece, you ever go to Santorini, it's a beautiful little place and you'll want to walk up and down it. But I would encourage you to actually go where you can snorkel, which is inside of a volcano. But inside of this, there was fly ash. And what Herod had discovered is you could take fly ash and you could actually get cement using fly ash to be able to cure underneath water. So he literally made these huge man-made stones, and he floated them out to where they needed to be, and then he sunk them exactly where they should be. And he made this beautiful harbor. When he designed Caesarea, when it was high tide, the waters would come in and it would go through the sewer system of the city. When it was low tide, it pulled it all out to the ocean and washed it away with the current. Yeah. So if you go to Caesarea at the time of Jesus or the time of Paul, you can actually sit in the public latrines. Yeah. Unbelievable. A lot of the archaeologists believe when you go to see where Pilate lived and actually where Felix and Festus would have lived, who were also procurators, that it's a beautiful place that's built out into the ocean, the Mediterranean Sea. And he had a swimming pool there. And at high tide, it filled the pool. And at low tide, it took it out. So it was always fresh. You know, now the big thing is to have salt pools, saltwater pools, right? Well, they had them back then. And Herod the Great knew how to build it. He built some of the most fantastic things in Israel. In fact, a lot of people would actually come to Israel from Rome to discover how to do what he was doing. That's why he's called Herod the Great. But he was not a Jew. He was an Edomian. In other words, his daddy was an Edom, Esau. And his mama was a Nabatean princess. Anyways. So let's find out what happened when Paul stood before Felix. First of all, this case was so important that the high priest and several prominent elders, along with a lawyer by the name of Tertullus, came down from Jerusalem to bring charges against Paul. As a lawyer, Tertullus was the one who addressed Felix, the judge, and these are the charges that he made, or the accusations he made against Paul. Look at Acts chapter 24, verses 5 and 6. For we have found him to be a troublemaker. Underline that word. A man who is constantly inciting the Jews throughout the world to riots and rebellions against the Roman government, which is punishable by what? Death. Oh, yeah. Remember what the high priest said about Jesus? It's expedient that one nation die rather than a nation, or one man die rather than a nation. Because he was afraid that Rome would come in, people were going to take Jesus and they were going to elevate him, and Rome would come in. So that was one of the incentives for them to put Jesus to death. He is a ringleader of the sect known as the Nazarenes. Moreover, he was trying to defile the temple when we arrested him. So Tertullus accused Paul of being a troublemaker. I had you underline that word troublemaker. Troublemaker is translated from the Greek word loimos, which means pestilence or plague. The Jews used it as a metaphor to describe a dangerous person, someone who carried a deadly disease and infected others. So it became synonymous with the word heretic. And that's what he's accusing Paul of being, a heretic. A heretic infects people with false doctrine. In other words, they're like a plague. Yeah. Now, After accusing Paul of being a heretic, he began describing how Paul was infecting others as a troublemaker or hectic, and why he was dangerous to Rome, or in other words, the Roman government. Look back at verse 5 again. For we have found him to be a troublemaker, a man who is constantly inciting the Jews throughout the world to riots and rebellions against the Roman government. So the accusation was Paul was inciting the Jews throughout the world to riot and to rebel against the Roman government, which was a lie. There wasn't a shred of truth to this. It was nothing more than a bow-faced lie, but that's all it takes to discredit a person. A lie. He was also accused of being the ringleader of the sect known as the Nazarenes, which is partly true because he was one of the leaders of the sect known as the Way, and sometimes it was referred to as the sect of the Nazarenes, but he wasn't the leader, he was only one of the leaders. Now, the reason this new sect was called the Nazarenes is because Jesus was from Nazareth, and it was actually a derogatory term. Remember when the educated people from Jerusalem, the high priests, the Pharisees, those who were the upper echelon, what they said about Nazareth? He's from Nazareth. One of his own disciples, Jesus said, has anything good come from Nazareth? Yeah, it was not well thought of. I've got into the reason for that when I taught on the Davidites. But anyways, you need to understand the new sect was called the Nazarenes because Jesus was from Nazareth. So the name of the sect referred to those who followed Jesus of Nazareth, hence the Nazarenes. But I want you to notice that Christianity is regarded as a sect of Judaism. Remember what a sect is. A sect is a group of people with somewhat different religious beliefs from those of a larger group that they belong to. But they're still regarded as being part of that group. So my point is this, even the Jews at that time regarded Christians as a part of Judaism. Yeah, that's why the Judaizers were saying to really be saved, first you have to be circumcised, keep the law, and then believe in Jesus. Why? Because they saw Christianity as a part of Judaism. Now, the last accusation that he made against Paul was that he tried to defile the temple, and that's why he was arrested. So in essence, what Tertullus wanted was for Felix to allow the Jews to judge Paul according to Jewish law. In other words, he wanted to take the case out of the Roman court system and move it to the Jewish court system, the Sanhedrin. Now, when Tertullus finished addressing the court, Paul spoke in his own defense. Now it's his turn. Look at Acts chapter 24, verses 10 through 13. Now it was Paul's turn. The governor motioned for him to rise and speak. Paul said, I know, sir, that you have been a judge of Jewish affairs for many years, and this gives me confidence as I make my defense. In other words, he'd been there a long time, and he knew enough about the Jews to know if they were blowing smoke or not. Yeah. You can quickly discover that it was no more than 12 days ago that I arrived in Jerusalem to worship at the temple. That's a very important detail. Take note of that. You can quickly ascertain that I was only in Jerusalem for 12 days. Go check it out. I didn't argue with anyone in the temple, nor did I incite a riot in any synagogue or in the streets of the city. These men certainly cannot prove the things they accuse me of doing. So, basically, this was Paul's defense. First of all, it had only been 12 days since Paul arrived in Jerusalem, and during that time, he had not disputed with anyone, nor had he incited crowds either in the temple or synagogues or in the city. Why? Because he had spent all his time with the members of the church of Jerusalem. He'd spent all of his time more specifically with James and the elders of the church of Jerusalem. Secondly, his accusers could not prove their charges against him. And I was going to say I'll explain why in just a little bit, but I just explained why. Paul had an alibi. He was with members of the church of Jerusalem the whole time. You can go check it out. Everyone knows James in Jerusalem. Even if you're not a believer in Jesus Christ, You know who James is. He is the most powerful man right now in Jerusalem. Yeah. And the elders of the church. This is what's causing all of these problems. The Gentile controversy that's going on. Everyone with me? And then Paul went into his personal beliefs. Look at Acts chapter 24, verses 14 through 16. But I admit that I follow the way, which they call a sect. Now, I want you to notice the word they because it's contrasted with the word I throughout this. They call Christianity or the way a sect. I worship the God of our ancestors, and I firmly believe the Jewish law and everything written in the books of prophecy. In other words, Paul does not believe that Christianity is a sect of Judaism, because all Jews should believe in the Messiah Jesus, who is the Messiah. He's the way. If you believe in the Jewish law and everything written in the books of prophecy, you'll believe in Jesus because they prophesy of Jesus. So what Paul is saying in his defense is any Jew who believes in the law and who believes in the prophets will also believe in Jesus because they point to Jesus. So Paul willingly admitted that he worshiped God according to the Christian way, which they called a sect, in other words, part of Judaism. The only difference being that they believed that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah, and being the Messiah, he had fulfilled the ceremonial law, atoning for our sins and reconciling us to God. And the reasons they believed that was because they believed everything that was written in the law and the prophets, which prophesied and pointed to Jesus. He was the fulfillment of all the messianic prophecies concerning his first coming. So all Jews should believe in Jesus. Man, Paul was good. Because what he's actually saying is, if you don't believe in Jesus, you don't believe in the law. You don't believe in the prophets. You want to have a little debate here? We'll go through these eschatological prophecies and we'll just find out if Jesus fulfilled them or not. That's how good Paul was. In fact, this is his defense. Then Paul goes on the offensive. You would have thought that was the offensive. Oh no, that was the defense. Now Paul goes on the offensive. Look at Acts chapter 24, verses 17 through 21. You gotta love the man. You gotta love him. After several years away, I returned to Jerusalem with money to aid my people and to offer sacrifices to God. He came with money? I thought money was bad. Oh no, money is not bad, people. You just need to have a biblical perspective of money. With money to aid my people and offer sacrifice to God. My accusers saw me in the temple as I was completing a purification ritual. There was no crowd around me and no rioting. But some Jews from the province of Asia were there, and they ought to be here to bring charges if they have anything to me. Where are my accusers? You can't bring someone that's doing hearsay. I want to hear from the person who accused me. Ask these men here what wrongdoing the Jewish High Council found in me. Why? Because the Pharisees all stood up for Paul once he said, I believe in the resurrection, and for this I'm on trial. Every Pharisee there said, we're for Paul. Now, they're not going to be for Paul when they get out of there, but we're not going to let the Sadducees have him. He says he's a Pharisee. Ask these men here what wrongdoing the Jewish High Council found in me, except for one thing I said when I shouted out. I am on trial before you today because I believe in the resurrection of the dead, and I'm guilty of that. You're guilty of what? I'm guilty of believing in the resurrection. Wow. So he admitted, yes, I was in the temple, but I didn't incite a riot. There wasn't any trouble at all when I was in the temple until certain Jews from Asia made a false accusation against me. And if there was any truth to their accusation, they should be the ones, not the high priests and the elders, making their accusation against me. Now, why didn't they show up? Anyone know? Because after all, this was a very important case, important enough for the high priest and his entourage to come, along with Tertullus, who was a well-known lawyer at that time, one of the most respected. He wouldn't be Matlock because he's the criminal attorney. He's known for being a prosecutor. He's a famous prosecutor. Anyways, so why didn't they show up? Well, I'll tell you why. Because their accusations wouldn't have held up against close scrutiny, and they knew it. Paul had an alibi for 12 days. He didn't go to the synagogues. He didn't cause any riots. He didn't debate with anyone. And when he was there, he went with these 4 people. You can pull them in, and they'll tell you Trophimus was not with them. They're Jews. In fact, more specifically, they're Pharisee Jews who believed in Jesus. And Roman law was very, very strict and harsh against those who made false accusations. In fact, Jewish laws too. If you go back to the Pentateuch, here's what's interesting. You make a false accusation against a person, and it's found to be false, and you knew it to be false, the punishment that would have came upon them had it been true goes upon you. Yeah. Rome had some very severe penalties for those who made false accusations. So, they didn't want to be anywhere near the court. In fact, they didn't want to have to face the judge, so they made sure they weren't there. And when Paul went on the offensive, he's pointing this out. Not one of these men were there. They don't know what happened. They didn't know what took place. The people who made the accusations, why aren't they here? And of course, Felix is no dummy. He knows why they're not there. And then Paul concluded his defense with this statement. There's only one thing I'm guilty of, believing in the resurrection of the dead. I love that. I'm going to read it again. Acts 24, verse 20, 21. Ask these men here what wrongdoing the Jewish high council found in me. Not a thing, except for one thing. I said when I shouted out, I'm on trial before you today because I believe in the resurrection of the dead. And Jesus was resurrected. Now, Felix was kind of wishy-washy, so he procrastinated on making a decision. You see, Felix knew that Paul was innocent, but he didn't want to offend the Jews. So he commanded Paul to be kept in custody until Lysias could come. But he did allow Paul to have limited freedom along with visitors. Look at Acts chapter 24, verse 23. He ordered an officer to keep Paul in custody, but to give him some freedom and allow his friends to visit him and take care of his needs. Now, if you don't know the customs of the time, this kind of sounds like Paul was given preferential treatment, but he wasn't. You see, the Romans didn't take responsibility for a prisoner's food and clothing. Why should we bear the cost of this? We've done nothing wrong. We're having to punish you because you did. So they did not take responsibility for a prisoner's food or clothing. So it was up to the prisoner's family or friends to do that. Now you know why Jesus made such a big deal about visiting those in prison. It doesn't apply to us today. Yes, you should still go and you should tell them about Jesus and minister to them. But you need to understand the reason Jesus made such a big deal about it is because if a Christian went to jail, he might starve to death. If you didn't visit a believer in prison, he wouldn't have any clothes. They'd just wear out and he'd eventually die of starvation. So Paul did not receive any preferential treatment. Not only that, Paul spent 2 years in prison waiting on Felix to make a decision. Look at Acts chapter 24, verse 27. 2 years went by in this way. Then Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and because Felix wanted to gain favor with the Jewish leaders, he left Paul in prison. 2 years. Now, Felix was eventually removed as the procurator, and Festus took over the position. It's easy to remember because Felix was the name of the one guy in The Odd Couple. You're not old enough, are you? There was an Odd Couple sitcom, and Felix was one of them. And of course, if you ever watch Gunsmoke, you had Festus. So you had Felix and Festus, two bumbling idiots. But I'm just teasing. Anyways, so with the I'm sorry, that was not good. They were just characters, so I'm not assassinating anyone's character. I want you to know that. So with the change of procurators came the resumption of Paul's trial. But this time, the Jews tried to exploit the situation, and they sought an extradition of Paul to Jerusalem because they found out we won't win in the Roman courts. We can't prove what we said because he's got an alibi, plus the ones who made the accusation. They're not going to show up because it's going to be proven false. So we're not going to win in the Roman court. So they show up to do what? To try to get an extradition of Paul to Jerusalem. But what they really wanted to do was to assassinate Paul while he was being moved to Jerusalem. Look at Acts chapter 25, verses 1 through 3. 3 days after Festus arrived in Caesarea to take over his new responsibilities, he left for Jerusalem, where the leading priests and other Jewish leaders met with him and made their accusations against Paul. They asked Festus as a favor to transfer Paul to Jerusalem. Their plan, here it is, their plan was to waylay and kill him. But old Festus didn't just fall off the turnip truck. And he knew what would happen if Paul went to Jerusalem, so he refused. And he told them, if they had any accusations against Paul, to come to Caesarea to make them. But that didn't mean that Festus was on Paul's side either. He just did that because Paul was a Roman citizen. And if he doesn't do what's right, he could end up being in trouble. Because the Jews were known to sail all the way to Rome to get an appearance to go before the Roman court there, kind of like the Supreme Court is today, and to say, this is wrong. And they could get the procurator in trouble. He knew that. So he wanted to appease the Jews. So during the trial, he asked Paul if he was willing to go to Jerusalem to stand trial there. Look at Acts chapter 25, verses 7 through 12. On Paul's arrival in court, the Jewish leaders from Jerusalem gathered around and made many serious accusations they couldn't prove. They didn't bring those witnesses. Paul denied the charges. I'm not guilty, he said. I've committed no crime against the Jewish laws. And he hadn't. Or the temple, or the Roman government. Then Festus, wanting to please the Jews, asked him, are you willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there? But Paul replied, no, this is the official Roman court, so I ought to be tried right here. You know very well I am not guilty. A blind man could see that, is what Paul is actually saying. If I've done something worthy of death, I don't refuse to die. I'll walk willingly out to where you're going to execute me. But if I'm innocent, neither you nor anyone else has a right to turn me over to these men to kill me. I appeal to Caesar. Festus conferred with his advisors and then replied, very well. You've appealed to Caesar, and to Caesar you shall go. Now, people, this was a catch-22 situation. If Paul had not appealed to Caesar, his trial would have been moved to Jerusalem because, in a sense, he would be acquiescing to what they wanted. And he probably would have been assassinated, and he understood that. So he had to appeal to Caesar. But his appeal to Caesar is what kept him from being set free. Turn to Acts chapter 26, verse 32, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. And Agrippa said to Festus he could be set free if he hadn't appealed to Caesar. So Paul was danged if he did, and Paul danged if he didn't. So, after 3 trials and 2 years of imprisonment in Caesarea, Paul was finally headed to Rome, where God wanted him to be in the first place, and where Paul could have gone without all the heartache if he had just listened to God. You know, you've heard me teach this when we teach on Bible doctrine. God is omniscient. That means that God is all-knowing. But many times, scholars like to debate on what that means. Does God have simple foreknowledge? In other words, does he simply know what's going to happen, but he doesn't know what could happen in every possible situation? Or does God have what's called middle knowledge, where God not only knows what will happen in the future, but he knows what could happen in every possible situation? And you know what the Bible teaches? God not only knows what will happen, but he knows what could happen in every possible situation. God already knows whether you're going to accept his son, Jesus Christ, or not. But God is fair. Don't you ever let anyone tell you God is not fair. If someone tells you God is not fair, that means that you can't be saved. Because fair means unbiased and just. But the core of it is just. If you're not playing by the rules, even a child knows, you're not being fair. In other words, you're not playing by the rules. God is fair. He's just. Jesus could not have died for our sins if he was not just. If he was a sinner, he had to die for himself, not for us. But God is also, in being fair, the reason they use the word fair, not just, is because God treats everyone the same. And you know what I love about God? Even if God knows what will happen in every possible situation, he knows who will reject him and who will receive him. Because God is fair, he will go out of his way giving you opportunities to receive Jesus Christ so that when you stand before God, you have no excuse for rejecting Jesus. None. None whatsoever. God has given us a free will, but he's also not given us an excuse to make this right decision with the free will. Don't listen to Calvinists. They don't know what they're talking about. This is not what the Bible teaches. Reason I bring that up is God knew what would happen if Paul went to Jerusalem. And he kept trying to tell him, don't go to Jerusalem. And eventually he gets Paul exactly where he wants him to be. But he could have saved himself a lot of heartache and grief if he had just done it God's way. That's why God wants you to do it his way. He wants you to get the most and the best out of life with the least amount of heartache and grief. We're going to have heartache and grief because we live in a sinful world. But God's for us. He's not against us. Let's stand. Next week we take a break and I'm going to teach on a messianic prophecy about Jesus Christ, who's the light of this world, coming into a dark earth. If you're here this morning, you've never received Jesus, you have no excuse. God doesn't predestine some to be saved and predestine others to go to hell. That's a lie straight from hell. You have a choice who you will serve this day. You'll either serve the devil or you'll serve Jesus. You'll either serve yourself or you'll serve God. If you're here this morning and never received Jesus, I'm going to give you the opportunity to be saved and make sure you get to go to heaven. And if you don't, take advantage of this opportunity. It's not God's fault. It's your fault. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say a very simple prayer. If you want to receive Jesus, who's the only way to heaven, all you have to do is repeat this prayer. The prayer's not magic. Just because you say it doesn't mean you're going to get to go to heaven. But if you believe what you're saying and you really mean it, it does mean that your sins will be forgiven and you'll get to go to heaven when you die. I want everyone to bow their heads, close their eyes. If you want to receive Jesus, just repeat this prayer after me. God, I know I'm a sinner, and I know that my sin has separated me from you. But God, I believe you love me. And because you love me, you sent your son Jesus to die for my sin. And I believe that when Jesus died, his soul went to hell to pay the penalty for my sin. But I also believe that when all my sin was paid for, God, you raised Jesus from the dead. So all my sins have been paid for. And because Jesus has been resurrected, I will be resurrected too. I believe that. Now, with every head bowed, every eye closed, if you said that prayer and meant it, you need to confess that Jesus is your Lord. I don't ever want to embarrass anyone, so I don't ask you to come forward. I don't send anyone to you. But if you said that prayer and meant it, you need to confess Jesus as Lord. So here's what I want you to do. I just want you to raise your hand real high. No one's looking but me. See the hand there? See the other hand? See the hand here? Anyone else? Anyone else? Best decision you'll ever make? All right. Let's give those three a hand. Lisa?